I have with me today Liam Murphy-Torres, who is a draftsman and a painter and a teacher based in West Philadelphia. He has studied painting at the Arts Students League of New York and Mount Gretna School of Art, and art history and aesthetics at the Barnes Foundation. He holds a BFA in painting from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He has shown in Philadelphia and teaches both locally and online. Liam, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. What would you like to talk about?
I would be really interested in sort of using this conversation as an opportunity to get into this relationship between painting and place. I think that a sense of place definitely is, it's something that became very important to me after I graduated, or even during my time in art school, towards the end, when I realized that uh, painting is sort of a mimetic representation of things was something that was helpful for me to enter a painting, but was not fulfilling as the sole result. And when I think about your paintings, I think there's a richness to them that comes from sort of the ability to distill and draw out the place that you are, the experience that you're having there. And I think you probably know a little bit more about it than me. And I thought I would use this opportunity to pick your brain and see uh, how it is you're getting there and maybe share some thoughts of my own about this topic.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'll do my best. It's not something I really think about, to be honest with you, like consciously. Because it deals with I suppose in a way a very sort of personal and kind of intimate and vulnerable relationship that I have to things, people, places, and sort of spaces around me, right, and different environments. Um, but it's funny. I was thinking about it as you were just talking, and I think that when I was younger, the very first thing I began to do that was arts related was draw, and I drew from a very young age. And I drew my whole life. And what I was initially interested in was illustration. But I was interested in the type of illustration that you would come across like in the Sunday comics. Particularly, I think my first introduction to that was like Jim Davis with Garfield, you know. And then I got into Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes. And there was a way that, especially Bill Watterson. I mean, I love Jim Davis, but Bill Watterson had this ability to agitate the characters emotionally and psychologically that I had not seen before. And he brilliantly weaves into the characters' way of being, sort of like their ontology. This depth, this sort of strong presence of humanity. And so as a young reader, I certainly found a place in that. Um, and it was always surprising at the level of creativity and invention that Watterson would bring to his characters and to the events that they experienced. After that was Berkeley Breathed, like Bloom County, Outland, Opus, you know, and these crazy characters like spastic Bill the Cat, you know, and the sensitive, you know, thoughtful and insightful Opus, the Penguin, you know, and like he had all these, and you know, this broad range of characters that really made room for humor, and different types of humor, and that could appeal to different readers and different levels of humor, which I thought was refreshing. You know, it was the humor itself was multidimensional. right? Like that content. And so for me, I think as a young child and you know, aging into my teen years, through middle school and high school, I think that the relationship that I formed to these characters, and to the creators of that content, I think have really stuck with me. You know, um, I delight in strangeness. I do, and there's plenty of strangeness to go around. You know, because there's this like weird phenomenology of things. You know, like what, you know, when I'm in the landscape and I'm like painting, I'm responding to like the movement and the articulation, this sort of gestural movement of a tree. You know, this tree at times will impress upon me a certain characterization of itself, you know, and I may find a place in that. In a similar way to how I would find a place in those comics, you know. Um, and I think what happened is from a very young age, I developed the sensitivity to to sort of like sussing out these elements of humor and personal expression and characterization, um, that that were really like the work, and the result of this like masterful understanding of these elements were given to me through these comics, you know, through these strips. And I read volumes of them. I love them. I wanted
Yeah,
to be I wanted to be one of them, you know.
yeah. The comics is interesting, first of all, because there are just so many painters to find their way in through things like comics, but also the way you're talking about them uh, makes the sort of the finding a characterization of a tree and understanding that through comics. Um, it makes me think of, I mean, Giorgio Morandi for sure, who's always at the forefront of my mind in everything I do. I think for the first few years of painting, I'm I started at the Art Students League of New York, and they would talk about anatomy and they would talk about the model. And so there was this idea that I could get things right. And as I sort of evolved, it was, oh, well, I need to get them right, but I also need to like compose them and make them interesting. When I had been aware of them existing for a while, but when I really first encountered Morandi's still lives and like actually was open to them and experienced them in a profound way, there's a way in which his bottles are more right than right. They're more bottle than real bottles are. That
Right. That's right.
characterization of, and really, it's caricature, right? They're caricatures of bottles. And that word can be used in such a demeaning way by people. I would think of like one time I had, not at any of the schools I've listed on my CV because I don't necessarily uh, associate with pride with this, but there was a drawing teacher who told a student that they should like go to Central Park and make caricatures, and sort of in like a, oh, you should stop trying to do that and do it my way, and here's sort of a um, like a little smack on the wrist for like doing what you were doing and make serious work. But caricature is so profound as like what's the essential, what's the nature of a thing, not like what's a thing, but like really what is it. It's not a jar, like it, or it is a jar, but it's not just a jar. It's
Mm-hmm.
this opening up to a place. and really getting at the interior life of something. And there's so many people who do it so well. The Pompeii frescoes as well, the Fayum portraits, right? They're not naturalistic portraits, right? Someone like, say, a John Singer Sargent could fix all the anatomy, but then it would look so much less like the person somehow. And I think that comic narrative really is an interesting way into that, because it sounds like I had to find that years in, but it sounds like you had it from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think I had a disposition towards it too, just because of I think maybe the way that I relate to things and people, and the way that I process information and make sense of my world. I need to, and this is the way that I learn too, because I've never been content with calling something a name, defining it by an utterance of sound. I've wanted to understand what it actually is, like phenomenologically, like beyond that, right? And so like there's and you've really described it beautifully, I think. You seem to really understand it on a deeper level, and it's the way that I've spoken of it before. Is like there's a way that something looks, right? Which is to say how it appears to be on the surface of things. And we would give it a passing glance and move on, right? We'd look at something and say, "Oh, that's a light switch. Okay, I know what that is," and I kind of move on. But we're missing the actual presence of that form, and what it's doing. Like because there's like a behavior to things. There's a behavior to every form, and and the way that the form is articulated, or the way that it articulates in space, conveys something about what it's doing, and conveys something about what it is. And with every variation of an articulated movement or a gesture, there's a level of energy to that, right?
Yeah.
And there's like a speed to it, like a certain kind of speed to that. And when you start talking about the quality of movement and the characterization of movement, and you start looking at the texture and the surface and the color and the edges and the expression of the form itself, the shape, the perceived weight, and how it fills a space and how the space interacts with it. These are all things that help to characterize it in a sense. And if one is perceptive or sensitive to these things, then you can have a lot of fun with that, because there's a broadness there's a range to that interpretation. And it really depends upon the participant, like the looker, the one who is viewing and engaging, or even perhaps touching, right? There's like this, or posing, or composing. Like there's this sort of level of interaction and engagement that occurs, that does range from person to person.
Well, there's that. There's the infinite variety of sort of infinitesimal shift in like the motif that you're seeing, right? So a tree might have a certain weight and and you have to really hone in on those things. But there's also, if you're a painter who works from life, and especially if you're a painter who works in duration, right? There's an extrapolation of all those qualities across time, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're out in the landscape and you're painting a tree and then a cloud passes over, well, now you're painting an entirely different tree. It reveals itself in a new and different way.
Hmm.
If you go home and you look at a book of Corot and you go back to that landscape, even if it were exactly the same, which it's never, but even if it was, um, your experience of Corot would mediate the way in which you see things. You would understand them in an entirely different way. And then if halfway through you started looking at it the way Frank Arbach looks at a landscape, again, you would. So there's the shifting of the thing, but there's also the shifting of the looking. Um, my eyes see very differently when I'm tired than when I'm awake. Um, so 3 hours into a session, I see things very differently than an hour in. And sometimes that's a loss of vision, and sometimes it's an incredible gain of insight. And the balance of those things, I mean, there really is so much to what you mentioned, not just what you mentioned, but the extrapolation of all those uh, qualities just stretched out over the duration of the painting. You
Hmm.
really have to start to make decisions about them.
Hmm. Yeah, and you know, when I paint from life, the thing that part of what I love about painting from life, and before you were talking about painting as like a form of mimesis, something that's mimetic. Um, in a way, it is, but the cool thing about as you know about the position of the painter is that we have options because we can decide what it is that we are mimicking, and that gets back into like what we were talking about earlier, when we look at a tree and like what are we really seeing? What are we really, I like to use the word participating, with, because I see it as an interaction. It's something, it's like a give and take, right? Um, because these things are alive and they're moving and they're a part of a spatial form, um, which is significant of a larger spatial construct that also is moving. Uh, and and so it's all of these things, happening. But one thing I love about painting from life is that I go into it without as much as I can, without presumption. And that's difficult because I'm not relying necessarily like on an established system. But more than anything, I'm actually working on disrupting the system or like breaking a system that I had established from the previous painting session. And I'm constantly doing that because it's a new context. It's like I have to recontextualize the painting because it's a different experience. Even if it's the same motif, it's
Mm-hmm.
still different. Just like you said, like because things are subject to change. Like a cloud passes over and the tree changes. And if you're perceptive to that, then you can make choices regarding how you want to treat that in your painting, or like these external influences, right? Like you look at a Corot or a Frank Auerbach, and uh, you might have there. I got it. You might have found a place and the way that they express their understanding of something, and to you were talking about the way that Corot sees or understands something, or way that Auerbach does, and that in of itself requires a high level of understanding. Well, one, painting, and two, people and psychology and the, I'd say, core issues of painting. Um, because because we're talking about something that they've arrived at through their sensibilities and through their kind of personal and intimate and vulnerable relationships that they've established to the subject, but also through the material and how they handle that, right? And that takes an amazing amount of insight, and understanding to begin to sort of find the essential elements that define their way of like being in the work, which goes, of course, beyond just a simple visual expression of, you know, of how they look different compared to, you know, other painters, or to nature itself, you know. But when I'm on location and I'm working from life, there is, like you said before, like there's this sense of being overwhelmed. There's so much going on, and it's like it's to the point that the only way that I can start painting is to just jump into that current and just be swept up by it, right? And just try to like fight my way through it. And you know, I don't ever come away, you know, from like a painting session thinking, oh, I finished a painting or something like that, you know. If I get enough in the painting to where I can pursue that painting later on in the studio, I consider that a great session, you know. But a lot of times I get back in the studio and I have no idea what I'm looking at. It takes a while to really kind of understand what the painting is doing and what I was even responding to out there.
Mhm. And I think the idea of like direct response is, it's true, but it's also a little misleading, at least for me. Um, when I respond to a thing, I go out to paint it. I About a year ago, I was going out to Manayunk every day, which is a neighborhood
Oh yeah.
sort of around it. It's technically in Philly, but it's sort of its own little, it's isolated a little bit more. It's a little bit older, a little less developed, although that's changing a little bit now. But it has these like narrow streets and these like beautiful stone row and brick row homes. And I would go out there every day, and I just found it so beautiful. And I painted in a whole body of work, and they came back to the studio, and I was working on them. Maybe they only got like 2 more sessions each, but I was working on them for about a year because it would need time to sit in the studio, and I would need to gain sort of insight. I spent a lot of time just looking at them, walking away, coming back the next week, and then going, oh, what if I made the sky slightly darker? But I realized that I had painted all these things because I found them beautiful, and that was it. And then I started to understand that my idea of beauty is so conditioned by painting that really I was painting them because the compositional like layout of the space reminded me of the way like Fra Angelico might divide things with arches, or so much of the early Italians ended up in those paintings, so much of Corot. Not because I was intentionally, I was later in the studio, but not because outside I was thinking about, well, how can I make this look like a Corot or a Morandi? But because I said, oh yeah, that shape is really exciting. And it was exciting to me because on some level, it reminded me of my sort of funded experience of the history of painting and of those particular painters who excite me the most. And that really, when I say this is beautiful, what I really mean is this reminds me of painting. And all those influences came back very directly, and those paintings almost look like they were done with like this intellectual preconception of, I'm going to go out there and find the correct geometry. And there are reports that Morandi actually did this, that he went out in the landscape with binoculars and black and white reproductions of Cezanne and Corot. I don't remember where I was reading this, but it was about the time I was working on those paintings. And he would move the binoculars until the like arrangements of light and dark felt to him like something that he was looking at in the reproductions. and then he would paint it.
Wow.
Whether
It's
that's
cool.
true or whether it's apocryphal, I don't exactly know. But someone wrote about it in a book somewhere, and that really is what I was doing, except I just wasn't conscious that I was doing it. So the idea of like surprise or not surprise, like premeditation and those sort of things existing on a sliding scale, it's hard to ever say where exactly I am on that scale.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, certainly, we don't experience these things independent of our influences, right? And our influences do help us understand, in a way, more about ourselves, the things that we are attracted to, and so yeah, like so you came to understand that what you found to be beautiful in nature was informed by what you found to be beautiful in painting, or what attracted you in painting. And but the cool thing is that those painters who made those paintings were also informed by their external influences, and at some point it all goes back to nature,
Mm-hmm.
and in our interaction with it. So yeah, you're right. I mean, there's always going to be, in some sense, the presence of those things, and our affections, right? The things that we're attached to, and the things that we desire, and things that we find to be important, will definitely and most certainly shape the way that we relate to everything around us, people, relationships, painting, everything, the way we handle our cars in traffic, and it's funny, like even the food that we eat, um and it's really in music we listen to, whatever, like so forth and so on. But that is something that I love, because in a way it's in a way we're never really separated or isolated from the painters that we love. Like we're a part of that current. We're connected to them in that way. Um, just by the practice of painting, and the presence of their influence, and how we filter that through our own work. But that's, I think, I love that story about Morandi, because I like Morandi as well. Like he's one of my favorite painters, and I've spent a lot of time looking at his landscapes, and I spent a lot of time looking at the landscape and still lifes and things like that, and with him in mind, um, as a way to try and understand what he was affected by, and what his values were, and how he sought to express that, through the material and through his picture making. Um, and I found that in doing so, there it actually helped me draw closer to who I am as a painter, like my nature as a painter. Um, I read that Cezanne and Pissarro did something very similar, except they really tried to disrobe everything, all their external influences, and just all of their academic training and rigor, and just head out into nature, and solely be informed by nature, and to allow it to shape as much as it possibly could, their sensibilities, and their understanding of form and pattern and rhythm and all these things. But you can't escape it, because that's what Piero was doing. Like he was a brilliant mathematician, and he was responding to the geometry that was found in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's the same thing that we're expressing in different ways. But that's I guess that's one of the wonderful things about beauty too, is that it can be expressed in so many different ways, and it never ceases. The virtue of it doesn't cease to be present in that expression of beauty in relation to another. It's simply just what we find ourselves attracted to.
I think the Cezanne and Pissarro like bit is interesting because there's this is on when he was with Pissarro, and there's definitely that element that like I want to strip everything else away and just get to nature. But then there's a sort of return. I think they're my favorite or one of my best, and I'm doing a lot of sort of thinking about Cezanne right now because I'm getting ready for a lecture on him. And one of the things he said was he wants to take impressionism and make it permanent, like the art in the Louvre. And I think that when I look at him, there's sort of uh, he's a very Roman painter for me. Like I think you can draw a direct line between Pompeii and Cezanne, but also he's a classical painter in the most radical sense. There's none of the sort of surface level finish of classicism, but there's this deeply logical struggle to make things make sense. Everything is positioned in accordance to the grid. There's a rigid, and I spend a lot of time with Cezanne in person. I'm lucky enough to work at the Barnes Foundation, and there are so many. And I spent hours and hours and hours with them. Everything is so deliberate.
Yes,
and
that's right.
I remember the Cezanne drawing show at MoMA. It feels like yesterday, but it was a few years ago now. And realizing that there's this like this insanity in a way, like this. Also, I would consider it like stubbornness, like where I would see these lines like redrawn, 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 and I remember thinking that Cezanne wasn't, and he said this himself. I would later go on to find out. But looking at those drawings, I thought, oh, he wasn't particularly talented, which is great because I'm not particularly talented either. He was just too stubborn to not make a great picture. And he like fought with these things until they worked. As opposed to someone like Pontormo, where it just like erupts out of him in this like magnificent explosion of brilliance. At least that's the way the drawings look. I'm sure there's a lot of artifice there and a hiding of the struggle. I'm sure there was struggle, especially earlier on, but Cezanne never gives up that struggle. And there's this real, like, we were talking earlier, I don't remember if it was before or after we started the recording, but about the fact that, like, for me, so much of great painting happens when things are placed with a certain sort of tension. And I think Cezanne is sort of the embodiment of that tension. There's like this very sort of like impulsive, animalistic, like brutal painter in there who's sort of making these wild gestural marks and like throwing everything over there. And then this like real stubborn, constrained, follow the like do it right, get it perfect, like this opposite personality. And every time I look at Cezanne, I see like this war play out between those two personas, this gestural, impulsive painter who's the most careful, considered classicist I know after And there's also a bit of like the Gothic imagination in there too. Like I think of that the card players that's in the Courtauld gallery. There's it's my favorite one. It's the most pared down. There's just the two players. There's something really like gothic about those figures. There's this like towering, like romantic other world. Like they're so, I guess they're just so much, you know. I feel like I'm looking almost up at a towering cathedral. Maybe not a Gothic one, but maybe more Romanesque than anything, with these like two figures that create this massive arch.
Hmm.
Um, and that to me, it's just Cezanne's such a strange, mysterious, wonderful painter to the point where it's hard for me to talk to about him in this improvisational way where I don't have my thoughts organized ahead of time because there's no telling where it could go.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, and I feel you on that. I mean, I recently taught an online course on Cezanne, and it was dealing with the way that his relationship to visual elements and the composition space and structuring space and things like that. And it was very surprising. I mean, you know, these these paintings that I've seen both in person and through reproductions, you know, they offer you something and something different or something broader and both experiences of looking at the image. And one thing I think that I think Cezanne was struggling with in a way was that he really was departing from systems that he had learned as much as he could by deconstructing them and recontextualizing them to make room to be able to sustain what he was experiencing, um, you know, through looking and through these relationships that he had been forming to his environment, and the way that he conceptualized space and form and all these things. So I think that there was a real struggle in that because there, you know, someone like Pontormo and these other great masterful artists, you know, they were able to develop within a system that was tried and true and provided them all the room to grow into their potential, you know, within that system. But Cezanne stepped out of that and wrestled with something I feel that was much more chaotic, you know, and difficult to define, difficult to establish boundaries to contain, which I believe is where the struggle is in his work, because it's a constant entering into chaos and bringing order into chaos, right? And I think that's where the the other side that you're sensing, you know, and Cezanne was a real attribute for him, real strength for him, because at first it caged him, it imprisoned him, but then it ended up being something like a touchstone. It ended up being something that he could use as opposed to feeling like it was using him, that he could use to bring order into chaos, and by picking and choosing what suited the needs of his process and the demands of the work in relation to what he was experiencing, you know. And he was able to develop he was able to develop a vernacular, a way of expressing and communicating these experiences within the language of painting that just weren't there before, you know, and that in that way. And I think that's where the real brilliance of Cezanne, you know, is. And yeah, he had to be brutal to do that because it requires brutality, it requires madness and conviction, deep, deep, deep conviction. And I'm sure he I'm sure he upset a lot of people around him, you know, in that pursuit. But what a gift, he was left behind for us.
Mm. Well, I think when we're talking about systems, we're like, I don't think necessarily Pontormo had a system. I think Pontormo was part of developing a system, right? Those guys were sort of, I mean, perspective was still relative, linear perspective, mathematical, because there are many um, understandings of perspective throughout history, and that itself is not a new concept. But the idea that you could mathematically regulate the perspective of an entire picture is still new. And then that concept becomes sort of a baseline for all these other ideas. You can mathematically regulate, say, a composition's geometry. And you get all these Fibonacci spirals and all this really interesting stuff. But for me, Pontormo is still early enough that he's not doing it on his own, but he's building that system in conversation with other people. I mean, the Mannerists are making a system that elaborates on the system of the High Renaissance, which is elaborating on the system of Giotto. So he has some groundwork, but he still has to develop. That system eventually stagnates, though. It eventually becomes a system. And that's when it sort of reaches a breaking point. The magic of, I think, Cezanne is that I can't think of, like, he had to more more actively participate in swapping out what tradition he was in, because I think Cezanne's pictures are inherently a product of tradition. I just think that he's sifting through a larger view of tradition. I think that at times he's an incredibly Byzantine painter, and he's using in places the Byzantine system. I think for the most part, his spatial construct is tied to, and I'm not sure how much he was deliberately aware of this, but he was using the same sort of spatial understanding that the Romans used. In fact, William Dunning wrote a book called Changing Images of Pictorial Space. It's one of the best books I've ever read about painting. And I think Syracuse is reprinting it right now, actually. And it's really fascinating because he's trying to write about like the way in which spatial constructs have evolved. And he starts with, in an early chapter, he starts by talking about a sort of Roman painting, and he's talking about the way in which it's not that there isn't perspective. It's that every object is put into perspective. It's just a different one. So there's no concept of them all existing in the same sort of empty space. And they had no concept of empty space. Space was created by the thing that held that space.
Right.
And that's exactly Cezanne's idea. And he writes about it. He doesn't write, I got this from the Romans. But if you went to a Roman painter and said, hey, Apelles, write down everything that you know about how to paint. And he did. He's actually Greek, but like the classical idea of painting. And you said, write down everything you know about painting. They would write something. And if you went to Cezanne and said, do the same thing, you would get a similar document. and it's a letter that Cezanne writes, where he talks about, well, everything can be essentialized into like the sphere, the cube, and the cone, and you just place those in to the picture and create. And this is in a letter he writes to an art student in his lifetime. But then you have the other Cezanne who writes, I paint from my sensations, which to me, it's interesting to talk to you about this because you're part of the perceptual painter group. And I think that perceptual, I paint from my perceptions would be an equally valid way to state that. The idea that you're working not from life, but from your experiences of life. And so understanding that things are experienced, things are perceived, things are sort of manipulated by the act of experiencing them, and that is just as valid a subject for painting as the thing. And so this tension again between his sensation and his system is really, I think, where the magic of Cezanne is.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. And the thing that's so wonderful is that, when Cezanne references a system, you know, whether it's something that had been established or evolved, through the Roman painting or something much later, the way that he can see it, the way that he can interpret it and contextualize it is something that is there's more freedom in how he interprets the systems and implements them in his own work, according to what he needs from it, and it's the same thing with his reference in that letter into these geometric forms. And there's, of course, different ways to interpret what he meant by the forms in of themselves and what those forms reference. It's a very dynamic thing to analyze a painter, and especially one that seems contradictory as Cezanne. But I personally feel that it wasn't so much contradiction as much as it was like Cezanne was able to find ways. He understood how things were connected, and so I think for him, the way that he understood space and the elements and the material and the picture plane and all these things obviously were shaped and informed by everything he had learned at that point. But as painters, we don't really just keep moving forward. We always circle back, right? So it's like what we leave, we come back to. But when we come back, we have all of this new sort of all of these experiences that we picked up along the way that can inform what we had indeed left behind. And so when we re-encounter it, it is something different because of what we can bring to it. And that's where I think sometimes it could seem contradictory, the things that Cezanne says from one person to the next, or from one time period to the next, the next instance. And so, but one thing that is clear is that in the work there is a consistent forming, like a shaping of his understanding of like light, color, modulation of form, flatness versus depth, and the space that is like in front of and beyond the picture plane, and of course behind it, and the way that, and like his conception of like the cube and the picture box and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly like what he's doing wasn't like it hadn't been done before. but perhaps just not in that context, not in that way, and not those combinations, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah. Well, Liam, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed our talk today. That was really great, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
I hope that it was of some benefit, you know, and that I was able to address. I'm not sure I mean, we got into it a little bit, the idea of place, you know, but
I think
it was
it's
really
always
interesting the
going
way
to
that
be,
conversation went. So that was nice.
I think it's always going to be the nature of like a conversation about painting to take many detours and tangents. I mean, we're trying to use words to describe something that is essentially nonverbal. And so detours kind of become very necessary, because every little square inch of a painting has so much in it, right? If you mix up a color, well, that color has so many associations. We would name it as blue, but really what we're talking about is like the blue of Giotto, which is also the navy blue of like a suit, which is also the blue of a sky, which is also the blue, and all those associations are laden. And then you put it down in a certain way, and there's a texture to it and a thickness. So all these things become sort of, I think in conversation, it becomes kind of essential to like go down every single one of those roads, because I don't think you can have a conversation and just name it as blue and then have anything of substance. So if a conversation about painting in place has to go down a very long detour about Cezanne, then or systems or thought, then it has to do that because it's the nature of what it is we were trying to do here. But thank you for inviting me and for doing this. It's an exciting concept, and I look forward to hearing the other conversations you have with other painters.
Well, thank you so much, Liam. That was very well said. Thanks for being open to these detours. I certainly enjoyed it. Hey, man, keep up the great work, and see you soon.
See you.
Take care.
Have a good one.
You too.